a heavy rainstorm in where no one lives is not a disaster. The disaster is the interface between hazards and people. And I see really the two key elements of the climate story now are how do we decarbonize the energy system? How do we cut emissions of greenhouse gases? And how do we cut vulnerability to climate hazards? There too. And it's not even the word adaptation, I think, is a flawed way to think about it because it's not just adapting to future change in climate, it's reducing vulnerability to the climate we know now.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. It's good to have you with us again today. My name is Regina, and I'm your host. Today, we'll be discussing 40 Years of Climate with Andrew Revkin. Andrew Revkin is a journalist, and he's been covering the climate crisis for, as I mentioned, over 40 years. He is an environmental journalist, author, and educator. He also created the first climate blog ever in a major newspaper that is .earth in the New York Times. And I remember reading this climate blog, and I have to tell you, Andrew, before your blog, there was precious little coverage on mainstream media. And I just remember, and it seems not so long ago when journalists, you could see in their eyes when you were watching news media, the fear of like climate change. I just remember that was
Yeah.
like considered like such a bad word, such a terrible thing to say. And when journalists started using this phrase, climate change, it was almost apologetically. It was kind of embarrassing. So I'm going to give you a tremendous amount of credit for being able to withstand the what I see is I don't want to call it capitulation, but I guess every media outlet has the people who pay the bills, and of course, those interests often, sadly, may determine what's discussed and what's not discussed. And I'm happy to say that probably, no doubt, because of your work, the New York Times has great climate coverage. Washington Post has done a tremendous job lately with their climate coverage. And one of the things I'm really, really interested in hearing from you, and no doubt our guests are as well, how you've seen the discussion of climate change in mainstream media.
I'll just quickly recap my own climate journey. I grew up in Rhode Island, loved science. I got a biology degree as an undergraduate at Brown University. Never thought about journalism and got out into the world in the 1980, 81, 82. After college, through fortunate circumstances. It's too long a story, but I came back wanting to become a journalist and did a 1 year master's degree at Columbia where they still had typewriters and all that stuff, and dove into being a science writer. I was at Science Digest magazine, which doesn't exist anymore. The early 80s were this kind of boom time for science journalism. There was a space shuttle program, there was computers, there was advertising for computers, and magazines were thriving. There was competition. AAAS had its own magazine, Science 81, Science 82, Discover. And then my first real climate story was in 1984. A bunch of scientists, as you know, and this is in the height of the Cold War, had done calculations showing that if we had a nuclear exchange, you could end up with a nuclear winter, meaning calamitous chilling of the planet. And I was assigned to do a story on that. It ended up being a cover story in the magazine. I went to Boulder, Colorado, to the supercomputer centers, and these are computer models that were already being used to study carbon dioxide heating of the climate. But in this case, they ran them to see, well, if you had all that smoke in the atmosphere, what would that do to the planet? And you can see here already, the media tend to sort of crystallize things in dramatic ways, like the Earth in an ice cube. Even as that story had come out, the reporting I did talked to Steve Schneider, one of the great climate scientists for this whole period, And he and another scientist had done analysis showing it was going to be more like a nuclear autumn. And, where's your headline in nuclear autumn, right? How do you sell nuclear autumn as a story in a newsroom that's focused on, at that time what Ronald Reagan was doing or, all kinds of things. So the need to sort of have crystalline dimensions to a story to present to your editors tended to be problematic. So nuclear winter became nuclear autumn, and there's a lot of lessons there related to global warming. By 1988, it was the summer of 1988, Yellowstone National Park was on fire. There was a drought, epic drought. Europe had a heat wave. We had heat waves that would now be considered unremarkable, but that then were records. And that was the year, of course, that Jim Hansen testified in a Senate hearing organized by Senator Wirth and others that by his calculations, human-driven global warming was already detectable. And that made it into a big story. And that was my next cover story. I'm at Discover magazine now. And it's kind of like interesting looking at the two together. This is just a couple of years apart. What had happened, I went to a meeting in Toronto. It was the first international conference on the changing atmosphere. This was in right around the time Hansen was testifying in DC. And I saw all of the dimensions of the climate story there. A lot of the context at the time was, well, we have the Montreal Protocol that's limiting the gases that were threatening the ozone layer. So let's just do this with climate. Have a treaty. We'll all agree and cut emissions. But there's a quote in this story from a Dutch environmental minister who said, well, this is CO2 is different than CFCs. He said, with chlorofluorocarbons, you could get all the executives of the companies that make them in one room, like 36 people. And with CO2, everything we do on Earth, driving a taxi cab in Boston or running a coal-fired power plant in Beijing, is contributing to the global warming problem. So he was warning then, this is more complicated than just a treaty or just a law. And that's where the dimensions of the story started to make it a bad fit for the news environment because we like stories that are discrete, that have a bad guy and a good guy. And, the things that get you on the front page often are the politics. I found once I got to the New York Times in 1995, the stories I did about climate change that were on the front page were mostly about the politics. They weren't about the impacts. They weren't about solutions. And you see that now with virtually every story is, we cover things like horse races and the politics of the climate bill back in the first decade of the 21st century, 2008, 2009. It was, well, what's their strategy? Who's going to get the bill? They're going to pass it or defeat it. And that was missing the much bigger realities of the climate problem, which are that it's global, that China and India are driving emissions now vastly more than we are. And how do you cram that all into an article, right? And that's the blog came out of my growing frustration with the need to sort of compress this thing into these things that we call stories. And the blog.earth became, it was 2,800 posts over 9 years with 100,000 comments, all of which I vetted. It was a discussion with my readers. It was multidimensional. And one day I would be thinking about the behavioral approaches to the climate problem. Another, a scientist literally a scientist in Siberia said, hey, I'm going to Siberia. Can you come? And I said, I'm not going to go there. The flies are terrible, but I'll take your dispatch. Send me stuff while you're there studying past climates and how they relate to global warming. So it had his voice and video clips and everything. And that I felt was a better fit for the climate problem. And now here, fast forward to today, just as you said, at the Times, there's now like 25 people doing what two of us did, 10, 20 years in 1990, around 2000. I took on the climate beat at the Times from 2000 till 2000, till I left the staff in the end of 2009. And even then, 2009, we had three or four reporters at the Copenhagen climate talks. Foreign reporter, me, Tom Zeller, Libby Rosenthal. So by then it was getting bigger. but it's not like today. And yet I have a lot of problems with the way the story is being covered today. But we can talk more about those things. I think a key revelation for me in tracking the science through all those decades came again around between 2002 and 2010. I was reporting increasingly on papers pointing to vulnerabilities to climate being the main reason you have big losses from climate events. That it's not just CO2, that we on the ground there are societal and structural issues that are create turn a heavy rainstorm into a devastating flood. You know, a heavy rainstorm in where no one lives is not a disaster. The disaster is the interface between hazards and people. And I see really the two key elements of the climate story now are how do we decarbonize the energy system? How do we cut emissions of greenhouse gases? And how do we cut vulnerability to climate hazards? There are two. And it's not even the word adaptation, I think, is a flawed way to think about it because it's not just adapting to future change in climate, it's reducing vulnerability to the climate we know now. So those two, they're two big stories in my head. Slowing global warming and cutting vulnerability. And vulnerability cutting seems to always get neglected because we're also focused on the need to cut carbon, which is there. But if you just do that and we triple the number of people living in Florida and the next hurricane comes, you've tripled the loss without any change in the climate. So that's the and that's the element I don't see enough of these days.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that with us. Yeah, and I really like that you brought up Florida. The Post has a few articles in it today, the Washington Post, regarding Florida and the many, many challenges it's facing and the outrageous temperatures in Miami in these
Right.
next few days. It's just crazy. Yeah, it's an amazing story, and you were there at the beginning of it. It's really exciting to hear your perspective. I know that Peter has some questions he'd like to ask you as well, so I'm going to slide it on over to Peter.
Andy, it's really great to virtually meet you. And I remember missing Dot Earth, and I didn't realize it was so long ago. It seemed just like yesterday. And if I could just make a comment, you were doing your blog at a time in which writing was on climate change was a real challenge, really difficult. It was a controversial topic. It was an uncomfortable topic. There was a lot of conflict involved in the topic, and your writing was absolutely superb. You brought great clarity to the confusion of the time. And what I can remember for myself is that on the science, you were absolutely, totally reliable. I could always go to your blog on a difficult science issue and really benefit greatly. So thanks very much for that. Of course, now I know why your daughter disappeared. So there you are. I want to ask you, we don't have the controversy any longer, but it is a very, very difficult topic because what I used to call, still call, telling the terrible truth is getting almost impossible to tell. So, do you have any thoughts on that challenge? I mean, it's a totally huge challenge.
Initially, I'll say, yeah, it's a huger challenge, I think, than most people think. The remedy isn't a more dramatic story, unfortunately. I embrace the idea, Timothy Morton, this philosopher, crystallized the concept of the hyperobject. These are things around us, phenomena in society that we think of as one thing, but that have vastly bigger dimensions in time and complexity. I wrote about him in National Geographic on the 30th year of my writing about global warming, where he had alluded to one of the Star Wars movies where they're in Han Solo's spaceship and they're hiding in the asteroid belt and they hide in a hole in the asteroid belt and they don't realize they're in the gut of a giant worm. And slowly they're realizing, oh shit, we're in the gut of a giant worm. And they just barely escape. That's a hyperobject. They thought it was a hole in the rock. And the climate on the widest scale, our need for energy, the human imperative for access to energy, which is a here and now thing. It's primordial. You know, it's like one of the definitions of life is taking energy sources around you and converting them into things, work or whatever. And we came across fossil fuels, and boy, oh boy, they provide virtually everything you would want: portability, energy density, and they have problems attached to them where they're extracted in places that kill people, or obviously conventional pollution. And then you get to CO2, which is the bubbles in beer, and it is a heat trapping gas that accumulates in the atmosphere, and you throw human nature at that, and you realize that there's so many aspects of the climate problem that are bad fits for aspects of how we work. And then you add on to that the layer of corporate control of government, and you can kind of lose your mind if you really dig in on those layers. And many people sadly are, in states of despair of various kinds. Robert Bruhl, a sociologist, and Carrie Norgard, another, they wrote a paper on what's called social inertia that I've alluded to several times. And there's a shortcut I made for it, j.mp/social inertia, all lowercase. And it's a paper that lays out the hyperobject of socioeconomic reality, such that even people who care deeply about climate change still find it hard to adjust parameters in their lives to that would actually meaningfully address it. So I'm just telling you, I agree with you completely on that. I call it, I use sometimes these hashtags, or I have little visual cards I throw on social media for the complexity monster and the scale monster. Those are just two of the dimensions of the climate problem that make it an enduring hyperobject too. That's one reason I've gotten away from thinking my job after 40 years of writing about this stuff is to just keep writing more stories. That's why I do my webcast, trying to connect people who work on different aspects of it, like reducing vulnerability to flooding in developing countries. Or I did when there was an outbreak flood from one of the Himalayan glaciers, I got reporters and glaciologists from the Himalayas into a conversation about how to deal with those threats. And I've done ones on conversations with members of Congress who are working on, Senator Whitehouse was on the show. And I had him on with students to see if they could help together find ways to press the case for changes in the oil companies. So given the dimensions of this thing, actually, it was the National Geographic story too, right? Back on my 30th year, whenever that was. I said, you can look at that hyper object, this massive social inertia machine, and just go screw it or yell louder, which I think is a failed strategy. The Guardian, for example, their style book requires their reporters to just not to say climate change, they have to say climate breakdown or emergency. That's fine. I personally think it's a waste of time. So the massiveness and complexity of this means that everyone on the planet can play a role in tweaking some knob for vulnerability or energy transition. And if you have 8 billion empowered people, that's pretty cool. Right now, we don't have that. We don't have 8 billion empowered people. This country spends whatever it is, $800 billion a year on defense. We spend our budget for U.S. Agency for International Development is like a fraction of a decimal point part of what we do just when we think about fostering progress in poor places. So there's so many opportunities to make a difference. And again, on my show, I've had artists, psychologists, activists, the whole gamut. And I think one way to think about the communication solution is to think more about what we can do to foster that exchange capacity of people who are reaching for information, or when they're replacing a boiler, making sure they're thinking about a hot water, a heat pump hot water heater. Does that make sense for a particular house? That kind of thing. So it's very different than storytelling. It's very different than what the New York Times does. And so that's why I'm kind of happy I'm doing what I'm doing, as opposed to writing more stories. And I do still have a Substack thing where I write just today, something more. So that's kind of how I deal with the hyperobject super complexity monster.
Thanks. It's really good to hear what you're doing, and it makes a great deal of sense in today's situation. So I thank you for that too.
For sure. Paul, what do you think about the hyper object monster thing that Andy's speaking of?
Well, there's so many questions. I think I could have several hours of questions for you, Andy, but I have to distill this into let's distill it into questions about the future. I mean, what can we do with the scale and complexity, of climate? And global tipping points are a big concern. I mean, there was a whole 500-page almost document by the University of Exeter that came out just for the last COP about global tipping points, and it talked about all the Earth system tipping points, the bad ones, loss of the Amazon rainforest. I know you've written about that. You've written about almost all topics, loss of glaciers in Greenland, Antarctica, etc. So it talks about, the only way to counteract some of these, which we're approaching very quickly based on early warning signals, etc., is to have human positive tipping points like renewable energy, solar, wind, battery technology, electric cars, etc. What are some of your present projects? I mean, you're still very active, I think, in trying to, I'll put in quotes, save the planet, or, have humans understand the problem at least, because we're obviously not doing anywhere near enough to slow down climate change. Even it's accelerating.
Yeah. My problem with the Exeter folks, and I did a conversation with Tim Lenton not long ago. If you're that convinced that there's imminent tipping points, Stefan Ramstorff comes to mind too, then if you're that smart a scientist, you also know that this idea of social tipping points leads to solutions that would take decades to play out, right? Because of the inertia in the climate system. If you're making an argument for imminence of irreversible dramatic change, and not talking about climate interventions like sun blocking, then I don't have much patience for your argument. And that, by the way, that doesn't mean I support sun
Okay. Well,
blocking
that was
technology.
my next question, because let's start with any intervention like solar radiation management is a big one, which people don't want to talk about, or a lot of scientists, mainstream people say no, no, no. And yet on the other hand, they're saying our world systems are going to collapse like next year in a decade, right? Loss of food supply, et cetera, et cetera. So, you need to look at the risks of doing some of these interventions versus not doing them, and the risks of not doing them are getting much, much higher, much, much faster. So, I mean, even global climate policy at the UN, the IPCC, the COP conferences, they all assume interventions in removing carbon now, carbon dioxide removal, carbon removal, and that's the term. Anytime you see the term net zero, they're implying that we'll have ways to remove carbon on a scale from the atmosphere or ocean system, right? So they're all assuming that now, even though we have no technologies to do it at scale, right? So and then so they're all for that now all of a sudden. And I would say even 5 years ago, they were all totally against the idea of carbon dioxide removal, because they're saying it might give the fossil fuel companies a free card to continue to emit. Right. But I say if we can remove carbon faster than the fossil fuel companies can produce the carbon-based fuels that cause the emissions, then fine. We could still keep burning fossil fuels if we could take out the carbon at double the rate it goes into the atmosphere, for example. But then SRM, nobody wants to talk about it. I say we change the name to SOS, which stands for Solar Optimization Systems, or Solar Optimizing Solutions. Right? Like the name is kind of, the acronym is bad to begin with. And names are important. So SOS, that's what I'm pushing. Gwyn Dyer is a Canadian author. He just wrote a great book called Intervention Earth, which is all about these very things. It was just published. I was fortunate enough to see him in Ottawa recently at the Writers' Festival. He's got a lot of good points. So I don't know. What do you think of, like, it's controversial. Maybe you don't want to say too much about SRM, but
I think several things. One thing that's become clear over the decades is that a lot of mainstream environmentalists are so stuck on the word no, that's their job, the no word, not this, not that they really don't have a yes, except for vacuous yeses that we know can't happen on timescales that matter. So I'd like to see a point when mainstream environmental groups, and then those who I don't know what we're going to do with those who are more like the Environmental Working Group, EWG, which they don't distinguish between research on iron uptake by the oceans, for example, as being a distinct need from what Russ George did, which I wrote about in the New York Times in 2016 off of British Columbia, with some collaboration with a native tribe, throwing, a few thousand pounds of iron into the ocean. And now the Make Sunsets people are toxifying the whole concept of solar radiation management by already trying to profit from balloon loads of sulfur they loft up into the stratosphere, and they're selling carbon credits. So somehow what I'd like to see from somebody is more of a way to, instead of calling for like a blanket ban on SRM, which was a lot of scientists and others have signed on to, saying we need responsible research on these technologies because we take this problem so seriously. We know if we just have all of our solutions in one basket, like mass deployment of electric vehicles, when we don't know how to do that yet, this isn't all of the above problem. Even if you exclude oil and gas, you have to acknowledge that the idea that we're not going to test iron deposition in the oceans as a way to suck carbon, then tell me what you're for. It's like, tell me what you're for.
Yeah.
I did a webcast with some folks in Australia. There was recent work, the massive wildfires off of near Queensland had sent huge clouds of combustion products over the Pacific there, and that resulted in an iron fertilization experiment. It was basically a massive bloom of plankton result. And volcanoes do this all the time. The idea of blanket no, when I see no, and even for seabed mining, I'm not for a total ban on seabed mining. I'm for, let's find places where countries that have economic zones where they're willing to do some experimentation on the best possible methods for seeing if there's some way to extract some of those valuable materials for clean energy industry. But I there too. A lot of my good friends are like, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about the Congo, and what about
Mhm.
the book that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize,
Yeah.
read about the human rights
Yeah.
depredations of Congo.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. Like, just look at what the International Maritime Organization has done. They decided to take sulfur out of all the shipping fuels in 2015, and then in 2020 tightened it. And James
Right.
Hansen is attributing the great warming acceleration to that very thing. Fewer marine clouds. So these things are going on, and yeah, I agree. Blanket no's are actually pretty ridiculous, I think.
And again, what you're doing here, what I do with my webcast, the more we can propagate ways to have civil conversations that don't, where people just don't go home and do nothing at the end, where someone says, okay, well, this is actually, take your idea and my idea, and then this thing here, let's see if we can do that in Dubuque. Finding actionable paths. And that's the other thing. I did a show, I wrote a piece a few months back on in the United States, the no conversation is extinct because we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and at least unless Trump gets in, and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which are masses of money. And the thing there, and I've said this over and over again, the gap is not something that needs a story to fill. It's, as Jigar Shah, who runs the Energy Department's loan program, massive pot of money. I had him on my show actually just after the infrastructure bill was passed, and he said the most crystalline thing. He said, look, here in the federal government, now we have the stuff, but we can't force you to use it. We can't force you to change your community's old incandescent streetlights to LEDs. We can't force you to electrify your school bus fleet. But the money is here, and the payback is here. We have the numbers. What we need, and I wish I have this clip I could just play for you. There are 19,500 communities in America, towns and cities and villages. We need one person in each of those places to be able to spend a couple of hours a week being the local maven, being the person who goes to the town council meeting or goes to the school board meeting and says, hey, our buses are old and the kids are getting sick from the fumes already, even setting aside global warming. And we can get a fast payback loan to change to electric buses. And here's how. That's what we need. And that's not a New York Times story. It's not a Washington Post story. It's a capacity for people to connect with information and expertise and get things done. And or to identify roadblocks, like we don't have enough electricians, obviously.
So I'm interested, in what you had to say, people advocating for these changes. And I'm wondering, what role do you think legislation has in this? For example, if combustion school buses that release a lot of toxic pollution into the air, if it were legislated that these needed to be phased out within a period of time, do you think that would have an equally good effect, a better effect? Would it be antagonistic?
I think it's not necessary, and it's probably not going to work because school budgets are all local. And you get into the whole history of that, the local funding for education for that particular thing. Streetlights, Jigger said half of the streetlights in America are still incandescent, and it's a lot of electricity. And there's a complete argument, financial argument for shifting, rapid payback, etc. That doesn't have to go through the politicized process of us and them legislation because of these bodies of money that were passed largely. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for regulation here. Natural gas, for sure. I wrote extensively about leakage of methane when I was still at the Times, 2009, a front page story. And what's so ironic there is if you keep the gas in a pipeline, then you get to sell it. So why would you have leaks? And so anyway, and I think the Biden moves on methane leakage reduction and the like are solid. So absolutely, there's a role for regulation. There's a role for other kinds. Efficiency standards, matter, just like the energy smart stickers mattered. But in the end, at least now for a number of years in the States, we have the assets, and it's more of an opportunity, an asset harvesting. It's an asset harvesting opportunity more than a regulatory restricting process, which is implicitly resisted. And then, as Steve Schneider told me back in 2007, the great climate scientist, he was in Australia for a year, and he gave a speech down there. And, he said, on these problems, you don't start with the hardest thing. You start with the demonstration project that can then build community enthusiasm and move forward. And, I think the thing he mentioned in his talk was like capturing the CO2 from a power plant and enriching the air in a greenhouse. But all he was saying was start with things that communities can look at and go, hey, that's interesting. Well, our streetlights are better and cheaper. And then you can build forward from there to do the harder things that require the heavier lifts and tougher tools.
One question I have, Andy, is I often fantasize that we'll actually solve the climate crisis by taking the US military budgets and the scientists and engineers that all have this amazing know-how to build weapons to kill people over and over and say, okay, we have a big enough crisis that let's take the entire US military budget for 1 year or 2 years and put all the people to working on solving some aspect of the climate crisis, either whether we decide it's renewables or solar or more carbon capture methods or solar, SOS, solar radiation management, save solar optimization systems, to say, okay, we're going to be serious and we're going to do something. And we've got enough weapons, we don't need to, we could take a couple of years out in developing more and try to do something for the entire planet. And that would send a message around the world that, hey, we don't need all this military buildup. So I don't know. Yeah. I mean, what do you think of something like that? What would you do with the money? Where do you think that you would put it?
Yeah, well, that's a good first question. And I think there's, again, these things don't happen overnight. I think there has been in the past some effort to reframe what we think of when we use the phrase national security and sort of widening the envelope there to understand that investing, this is not just for solving the CO2 problem, but solving the vulnerability problem.
Right.
Investing for development in sub-Saharan Africa is a climate strategy because you're creating more capacity to withstand some of what's coming and some of what's already there. We don't do that nearly enough. In 2009, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had a Marine and a Navy officer wrote a report on reframing national security from a sort of a defensive posture to what they call sustainment posture. And then the pieces kind of come into focus more clearly. You realize, well, what generates conflict? What generates war? It's not just the lack of the enemy having a stronger army. It's lots of things on the ground. So if you can shift that understanding of making our development work more fundamentally part of a global resilience policy, that can lead to better outcomes. When I was at ProPublica, right here, in 2017, I wrote a piece about this, touching on this, where Secretary of Defense Mattis at the time was at this security conference in Germany, and a European official was saying, you know, the money we invest in development in Africa is part of our security money. She was making the case that, you know, if you start with a systemic approach to it's not just defense. Like, why is it the Defense Department as opposed to the Resilience Department?
Right.
And so I think that feels to me like a step toward what you're talking about.
Like, just to give you an interesting example, just yesterday there was massive tornado swarms across parts of the US, Iowa, and entire places were wiped off the map, basically. Total obliteration of infrastructure, many people killed. You know, but this was a weather event, right? This was a tornado. You know, some people still call it an act of God, right? If a nation, say a foreign nation, did this to the US, right? Can you imagine the response? Right? It would be enormous. But because the cause is a tornado, you know, a so-called act of God, according to some people, you know, but I mean, these things we know are all getting worse because of our fossil fuel emissions, changing the chemistry of the atmosphere and ocean, right? So it's just kind of it's like sometimes I feel like I'm in a Twilight Zone episode, a continuously running Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, well, although I mean, to me, one path to sanity is to carefully assess hazard by hazard what is known and not known about global warming and that hazard. And tornadoes, I've written extensively about tornadoes, far too much, covered one of the rare F5s in Maryland, and a lot on the climate question. And there's no evidence of climate changing tornadoes, not appreciably, not within any way that you could say, if you cut CO2, it's going to tame tornadoes. It's not. They're local rare events. It's good not to fall into the trap of looking at every extreme event that happens and saying, oh my God, global warming made it worse, therefore we need to stop global warming. And then to me, that just empowers people on the other side of the argument who the last thing you want to do is give them a good argument.
Right, exactly. Peter, did you have a last question or two?
Very short, just two things. I really agree with you, Paul. I think you're on completely the right track. But first, I've got to say, you know, obviously, if we don't establish warless peace in the world, we're not going to achieve anything. And achieving what we've already been talked about, of course, is the biggest thing of all. And for years and years and years, I've been almost confronted by people saying, this is not feasible. That's not feasible. No, we can't do that. So we're still in that. And so I just want to share with you, when I was co-authoring the book and we were looking at big solutions, a big problem, I thought I knew all about the Manhattan Project. And I thought I knew all about the Marshall Plan, right? Because I thought, well, these are two great examples that at least are good examples of what even one country can achieve, which is impossible. So what I want to share with you is that particularly on the Manhattan Project, it really was impossible. I mean, these scientists started with nothing, just, you know, squiggles on their whiteboard, and every component of that project they had to develop from scratch. And actually, they really did it from serious start to serious finish over just a couple of years. Yeah, I just want to agree with you, Paul, Why
Yeah.
on earth don't we throw all our resources at this humongous, hairy problem, right? And see what we can achieve. But again, we've really got to look into establish a warless world, disarmament, rapid disarmament. I mean, that's never been more obvious than it is today. So
Yeah.
thanks very much, and thanks, Harry. It was great listening to you, all your experiences, and yeah, you've achieved a lot.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah. Well, what you said circles back to the nuclear winter story too.
Exactly,
You
it
know,
does. Yeah.
and you're absolutely right. None of this happens on a planet that's fundamentally either on the brink of or in war. That climate will always be secondary or tertiary, and there are people who understand the conditions that foster peace and sustainability. They're out there that you don't hear from them enough, and that's a predicate for everything we're talking about. A world that's fraught and broken down and not cooperating is not a world that's going to deal very well with global warming, which requires cooperation, innovation, um, and empathy.
There's definitely much more where this came from. Andy has shared his Substack, and we're going to include some of his links in the description down below. So please be sure to check them out. And for those of you who have stayed to the end, we have a very special treat for you, and that is a musical outro by none other than Andy Revkin. Andy, break a leg.
I've been a musician, way longer than I've been a journalist. I started when I was 17, and I hung with Pete Seeger, all the time I was in the Hudson Valley, trading songs and playing songs and writing songs. And I just see, as anyone who knew my .earth blog knows, I'm a multimedia communicator, right? So, and to me, the music is just another way to do it. And you can fill in gaps. There's things I could write a song about that I can't really write a story about. And a long time ago, it was the Iraq War when I was thinking about carbon and fossil fuels. And I wrote this song called Liberated Carbon. It took 1,000 generations for our species to rise. To gather and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. And someone came along and said, hey, try lighting this. He opened up the ground and showed us coal and oil. Said, come liberate some carbon, it'll make your blood boil. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Come on and liberate some carbon, babe, it's the American way. Now I got peat swamp fossils running my TV. BP's Black Label burns in my SUV. We can light up the planet like a Christmas tree. They say that things are getting hot, but hey, we've got AC. Adaptation. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe, it's the human way. Pump those electrons and that gasoline. No sweat or hurry, just turn on a machine. We send an army to the desert to keep this country free. Hey, hey, and to liberate some carbon, baby, for you and me. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, baby. It's the human way, at least for now, but not too long. Liberated carbon.
Wow, this has been a really, really interesting show today. I'm really grateful, Andy, for you to come on and share your historical experience with not just the New York Times, but with covering the climate crisis for the last 40 years. It was so interesting to hear your experience, and we really, really appreciate all the work that you've done. If you in the audience appreciate the work that we've done and you enjoyed listening to our special guest, Andy Revkin, please make sure that you share this video with all your friends and family, and that you also like, share, and subscribe. And leave a comment down below. We love to hear what you think about each and every show. So thank you so much for being a part of our growing audience here at the Climate Emergency Forum.